that's me. I looked that relaxed once about 4 years ago. Somebody took a picture. I haven't really looked that way since. That's Rock Spring Farm. That's where that's kind of the view looking out the window of my office right now. We live in very hilly country up here in northeast Iowa. We're just a mile south of the Minnesota state line. We're in the driftless region of Iowa, so unlike the flat rest of the state, we've got a lot of hills and valleys here because we've been eroding for another 3,000 or 6,000 years because we didn't get glaciated in the last ice age. We're about 30 miles away from the Mississippi River here, and my farm's located up on top of the watershed. One of the nice things about this area is that because of the hills and valleys, we haven't had the sort of large-scale agricultural development that has dominated the rest of the state, the rest of the Midwest, and it's meant that we've had a lot of small-scale and organic farmers who've been in the area, and there's always been a lot more acceptance of alternative agriculture in the area. We got my start in farming back in 1990. I grew up in Seattle, Washington, right in the middle of the city, and didn't realize that I wanted to be a farmer until I landed at Deep Springs, which is an odd little school out on the California-Nevada state line. It's a liberal arts college, and the college is located on a working beef and alfalfa ranch, and that's all the students work 20 to 30 hours a week on the ranch. I went hoping that I was going to learn to be a cowboy. They stuck me in the garden. I learned that I was actually afraid of cows and that I really liked vegetables and decided this is how I was going to spend the rest of my life. Proceeded to move all around the country, worked on a number of different operations before I finally settled here in northeast Iowa in 1999. Had the privilege of doing some consulting work for Cascadian Farm, which really influenced a lot of my thoughts about scaling up and what large-scale business looks like. Managed a farm out in Maine, worked for Michael Ebbleman at Fairview Gardens, worked for Harmony Valley Farm in Wisconsin, and then again finally landed here at Rock Spring Farm in 1999. We've always really emphasized very clean products here. I think this is partly due to my predilections. I like to cook. It's also due to the background that I had with farming, and the farmers that I worked for always really emphasized high quality produce. And it's hard to distinguish quality when you're at a farmer's market. Shelf life is certainly a component of that, but also cleanliness was one way that we found. The cleaner the products were, the more money we could charge for them, the more money we made. We've always worked really hard on extended season. Here we're in about zone 4, and that means that there's ample opportunity for us to do season extension. We're on the 43rd latitude, which is the same as Elliott Coleman. Gives us a lot of opportunities to grow crops throughout the winter time, as well as to really expand our quality offerings in the spring and in the fall by doing things like tomatoes and cucumbers in the greenhouses. And then we've always focused on those two, the clean and the extended season point to this. We've always focused on what we think of as upgraded basics. So looking for products that people like to eat. I am the largest radicchio grower in the state of Iowa, but that means I only sell about 8 cases a year, and nobody's going to get rich doing that. So we're looking for products that people are already used to consuming. Things like broccoli, things like squash, things like carrots. But when we do squash, we only pick the very ripest of the winter squash. When we do carrots, we make sure that they're really clean and are varieties that have excellent flavor to them, as a way of getting at things that we can sell large volumes of, but where we can command some premium pricing. We grew the farm very rapidly here. When I started the operation, I had already had 10 years of experience and had a significant amount of capital put together. I had a farming partner at the time who had a similar level of experience to what I had, and we were able to jump in and really make a go at things, really grow quickly. At our peak, we were selling almost $300,000 a year worth of produce through wholesale outlets, farmers market, and a CSA, as well as some sales to wholesale distributors at that time. And for the first 9 years on the farm, I did a lot of the work myself. I was out, planting the crops, doing the transplanting, doing the cultivating, doing the harvesting, doing the packing, driving the deliveries. That's changed a lot in the last few years. We really began making some of these changes starting with a series of a series of unfortunate events that happened 2007 through 2009. We had two 500-year floods in less than 10 months, and then I got a divorce, which meant I lost my farming partner, and proceeded to hire a farm manager, and at the same, and which really was something that led me to do more, having to think about my business as a business rather than just thinking about it as something that I did. So really tried to begin to frame the development of the farm over the last 4 years from that perspective. Then at the same time that was happening, I had some opportunities where the Leopold Institute hired me to go out and do some evaluations of different farming operations and looking at their post-harvest handling as well as looking at their transplant production, comparing systems, looking at the ways that different farmers were accomplishing different tasks, and then summarizing and collating that information. So when I started getting out and talking to other farmers, I found there was a need to actually do more education and consulting work, and have tended to have moved more and more in that direction in the last several years. At this point, on my farm, as a single parent and as looking at the quality of life considerations that I've got, we've actually decided to really dramatically scale back our production this year and focus on the education and consulting business, which I call Flying Rutabaga Works. So when there's always a lot of talk. Right now, if you want to get funding to do a project in sustainable agriculture, you use a couple of keywords. The first one is food safety, and the second one is scaling up. And if you say those two things, people will start throwing money at you. And I think a lot of times when people go through this process of scaling up, or really almost any decision that they make on the farm, people are oftentimes rolling the dice between money, time, and quality of life. I mean, they're not taking into account everything that you're going to be trading. I mean, if you're going to make more money and it takes more time, then, you're trading. Obviously, you trade time for money, but are you trading those things off for quality of life? A lot of times you make quality of life decisions. For example, when we decided to stop doing the farmers market on our farm, we did that for quality of life reasons. I wanted to be able to go to my daughter's soccer games on Saturday. But it meant that we were taking less money in for our product. But it also created more time. We were able to do more timely operations with our field work. So I think trying to evaluate and think about how all those pieces fit together is important in any decision that we make on the farm. For me, I know about stress. I certainly lived that. I still live it a lot. But stress is the dissonance between priorities and the application of resources. And I think scaling up really hits at this. A lot of times people say you should be scaling up. Again, if you don't know why you're scaling up, if you don't know what your priorities are, what you hope to accomplish by that, it's hard to know how to effectively apply your resources in that process. Skip that slide. I also think that in our society, I've observed this particularly in rural America, but I think it's prevalent just about everywhere. We tend to value hard work over effectiveness. We say, that nobody ever comes to your vegetable farm and goes, oh, you're really effective. You get a lot done with very little effort. People come and they say, wow, you work really hard, and that's the kind of thing that you get praised for as a farmer. And I think we actually need to be thinking a lot more about working smarter rather than working harder, which is really going to mean working smarter. It comes right down to prices. We want to maximize our return on our investment. Okay. So getting your prices right is really important. Of course, you want to know that you're making money. And if you don't understand how pricing works, and if you don't understand things like your cost of production, then you're not ever going to know whether you're really getting ahead at what you're doing. Should you be planting more tomatoes, or should you be planting more carrots? Do you need to invest in equipment that can help you become more efficient in harvesting your broccoli, or do you need to invest in equipment and scale up your production of green beans? Those are the kinds of questions that we want to start to get at when we're looking at these things. Knowing whether you're making money is going to help you to know what you should be pushing at the farmers market. It also helps you know where you need to raise prices or where you need to discontinue products. I remember going to farmers market one time, and we were was working for Richard DeWild at Harmony Valley Farm at the time. We were selling this crop called ground cherries, and it was a pretty marginal crop. You couldn't get a lot of money for it. I was really excited about them because they were weird and unique, and I like weird and unique vegetables. And I was pushing them at market, and Richard finally pulled me aside. He said, you know, Chris, we just don't make that much money on ground cherries, and I need you to stop pushing those. Why don't you push something we do make money on, like salad mix? So I went back and got more excited about salad mix. But having those kinds of at least instincts for what you're making money on, but hopefully backing some of that up by data is really important. I see this with CSA farmers a lot, say that it really isn't important to get their pricing right. It isn't important to know their cost of production on any given crop, because really it's the whole package. But so often now CSAs have turned into subscription models rather than a community of members engaged in a mutually beneficial relationship. If you're going to do a subscription, you've got to know the total value of your CSA share. And I work with a farm recently. We were looking at their numbers, and it turns out that when we compared what they were selling their CSA share, the price they were getting for their CSA share versus the pricing on the produce that went into the CSA share, they're selling that CSA share at wholesale prices. They're selling it at the same prices they would have gotten if they were selling those products directly to the store. And yes, there's a little bit of quality slippage that goes into that farm's CSA, and yes, there are some differences between doing retail sales at the farmer's market and getting a CSA, but they're certainly adding a lot more labor and a lot more value both in the packaging part of that as well as in the marketing part of that, so that they need to be getting a better price than just wholesale pricing for their CSA produce. So again, knowing what the value is, and of course you don't want to build a CSA that's known for growing really expensive crops. I mean, if you've got something that costs 25% of your production budget but only goes in 5 or 6 different boxes, that's probably not a very good value either for you or your CSA members. And a lot of doing pricing, unfortunately, comes down to doing math. And I know that the moment you throw out numbers or you put out an algebraic equation up on the screen, it tends to freak people out. So I always like to remind people, keep calm and do the math. It's pretty simple and pretty straightforward stuff. And if you think about and hopefully understand some of the reasoning behind what we're doing, it does make the math a lot easier to do when you know what's going on in the background. I want to take a look first when we talk about pricing at some very basic pricing rules of thumb. One of the questions I get from beginning growers is, how do you know how much to charge? If you don't know your cost of production, if you don't have the kind of network of people that can help you set your prices, and Chris, if you're saying that farmers market prices are oftentimes priced at or below the cost of production, how do I know how to set my prices? So I want to throw out some rules of thumb that I've heard from folks over the years. This is one that Richard DeWild told me at Harmony Valley is a way that he set his prices, which is that you should be making, when you sell a product, 4 times the cost of harvesting, washing, and packing that product. This is one way to look at it. So if it costs you $10 an hour for labor, and your labor is able to harvest, wash, and pack 100 bunches of a product in 4 hours, then you figure that out and multiply it all by 4. You get $1.60 a bunch is what you ought to be charging for that to get a most basic, reasonably profitable price. Obviously, we don't know what the margin looks like on that. We don't no way to tell or compare the other elements besides harvesting. But because harvesting is such an important component of the total cost, because of the time involved, it's an important component of the total cost of an end product. Most farms that I work with have labor costs that are running at between 37 and 52% of their total expenses. So it's clearly the major variable cost in an operation, and therefore is likely to be the major variable cost in producing any given product. Paul and Sandy Arnold out in upstate New York have a rule of thumb that they say they want to grow any crop that they want to be making $20,000 an acre on it. Now, it's easy to do that if you evaluate backwards. You say, okay, we grew how many acres of peas, then how many dollars did we sell, and do the math. That doesn't always help you to get the prices right in those early years when those kinds of profitability and cash flow is so important on the farm. So this is a formula you can use to say, how do I, what am I, if I've got a certain amount of product and I know how much I'm going to get off of it over the course of a week, and I know how many weeks I'm going to harvest, what do I need to be selling it for to get that $20,000 an acre? And so what I've done here is if every week you can get 60 bunches off of your plot of Swiss chard, then you know that you're going to harvest that Swiss chard for 6 weeks, and you know you want to get $20,000 per acre, and your bed of Swiss chard is 1/30th of an acre. On our farm, that's a 300-foot bed that's 5 feet wide, is about 1/30th of an acre. And you can set this up so that then the week crosses out the week, the acre crosses out the acre, and then you end up getting dollars per bunch here at the end, $1.84 a bunch. So that would be another way of calculating that price on a product that's getting harvested multiple times over the course of a year. Of course, the other way to do your pricing is to walk around market. We always used to have a saying at farmers market. I'd always say, I will not be oversold. I made certain that nobody ever had a higher price than I did at farmers market. If they did, I would see their price and raise it a quarter. We insisted that we were going to get the highest price. That partly that pushed us to have the best possible product we could have, but it also made sure that we weren't underselling ourselves when we didn't necessarily have good information on our cost of production. And why would you sell them? I mean, if I have the best produce at market, why would I sell my produce for less than what somebody else is selling it for? A lot of people go to market and they measure success by the fact that they sold out of product. And I like to tell a story about going. We had another farm that started farming the same year that we did. They were in southeast Minnesota. We did the farmers market in Rochester, Minnesota together. Their stand was right next to ours. And we both showed up with carrots for the first time in the season. And Trish and Jerry took the carrots out of the back of their van, and they put them out on their stand. They had a couple of crates of carrots, and they were selling them $2 a bunch. And so they maybe had 20 or 30 bunches of carrots. They sold out in the first 45 minutes. Now, we had taken a couple of crates of carrots out of the back of our vehicle, set them out on the table. We were selling ours for $3 a bunch. Jerry said, and ours didn't sell for those first few minutes, but then Jerry sold out. And he came over to me and says, I sold out of carrots. I said, that's great, Jerry. He said, well, your prices must have been too high. I said, I don't think so, Jerry. Because we proceeded in the next half hour to sell out the first couple of crates of carrots, and then we proceeded to bring out 10 or 20 more crates of carrots, and we actually sold 200 bunches of carrots that day at $3 a bunch. At the end of the day, we took home a few bunches of carrots. But at the end of the day, we were still pulling people to our stand. We had carrots. Nobody else had carrots at the end of the day. We were bringing them to our stand and selling products that other people still had at the end of the day because people were already at our stand and were ready to buy them. If you underprice your products, you don't have the opportunity. You're not going to maximize your sales. You actually want to take some product home. If you sell everything that you bring to farmers market, that means your prices were actually too low. Okay? You could have gotten a higher price because you could have made that last sale in the last couple of minutes of market, right? And I'm going to come back to that in just a moment, because the other story I want to tell about setting prices is the simple ask, especially if you're doing wholesale marketing, of asking, what is the market look like? What can the market bear? We do a lot of asparagus on our farm, and I talked to a produce buyer last year. I was preparing to sell my product. I can't remember what the price was. It was something like $3.50 a pound, and I called the produce manager at the Wedge Food Co-op, and I said, hey Dean, what can you guys bear on asparagus this year? I mean, I do okay at $3.50 a pound, but what can you guys pay? And he said, well, He said, Chris, you know, the asparagus that's coming out of Michigan is running at $4.20 a pound right now. So I was able to realize a 15% price increase simply by making one phone call and asking. And the great thing about a price increase, right, if down here at the bottom we've got our cost of production and I sell a product at this price, this is my profit, okay? But if I raise that price, every penny that I add to the price doesn't cost me any more to produce it. It doesn't cost me any more to market it, and therefore every penny that I add is actually dramatically increasing my profit. Okay, that's the wonderful thing about getting your pricing right. You can sit there and try to shave off cost of production, but boy, if you could raise your prices by a nickel, that's a free 5 cents for every unit that you're selling. And if you can start to see price increases like 15% price increases. In the case of the asparagus, that was 70 cents that I was making extra for every pound that I sold off of the farm. And if you're scaling up your production, that can make a huge difference over the course of 1,000 pounds of asparagus sold in a season. The other thing that you can do for pricing, if you don't have folks that you can go to and talk to in your stores, or if you're not sure that you're getting good information from them, is to work backwards using margin tools. So this is something that really applies when you're trying to figure out what a wholesale price should be. When I talk about wholesale, I'm talking about selling to restaurants or stores or to wholesale distributors. So all of these operations use tools called they use a tool called margin pricing, and then that's going to be the basis that you can use to figure out if somebody's selling something for a certain price in the store, how much are they paying for it, and how much is the grower getting for it. And I want to walk through that. Different markets have different margins. Okay, so when I talk about different margins or different markets, so we sell to a warehouse in the Twin Cities called Co-op Partners. Co-op Partners buys their product from me, okay? Then they use a margin. They mark that product up, okay? And then they're going to turn around and sell that product to the store. And the store is going to mark that product up, and they're going to sell that product to the consumer. Okay? Now at a retail store in the natural foods industry, the normal margin for selling product is 42%. Okay, so and this is just an illustration of what a margin means. If something costs, if you're going to go into the store and pay $1 for a bell pepper, okay, and that store is running on a 42% margin, that means they paid 58 cents for that product. Okay, so it's their direct cost, what they're actually paying for the product itself, is going to be 58% of the total cost that they're selling the product for. Okay. This is a mathematical formula that you can use to calculate a margin. You take the cost of the product, so that's the price that the store is paying for the product, and you divide that by 1 minus the margin percent. So, you know, in that case, it's, you know, this is going to be, if you put $2 over here on the sales price, they're paying $1.16, 1 minus 42% here. So 58, they've got a 42% margin, okay? $1.16 divided by 1 minus 42% is going to equal $2. Okay? Now, the store doesn't actually get a 42% margin on that. Usually the margin that they're actually going to realize is 35%. And they realize that because of what they call shrink, right? That's simply the amount of product that they have to trim or throw away. So when if they're paying for a pound of lettuce and they have to go through that lettuce and throw some of the leaves away, or if they have to cull a rotten bell pepper or take out the mushy onions, okay, that shrink in the natural foods industry usually runs about 7% at the store level. So they're actually realizing a 35% margin. Now, if you're selling to a distributor, distributors are usually, and again, this is natural foods industry that I'm talking about, distributors are usually using like a 23% margin. So the cost of the product is 77%, the margin's 23%, that adds up to 1. And the reason why this makes a difference, right, they're doing this for quite a bit less their markup, their margin is smaller than the margin in the store. That's because their cost per unit are relatively lower, and their risk is relatively lower. Okay, so they're not dealing with the vagaries of the retail marketplace. They're buying in more or less what they know they're going to sell because they're playing a volume game. The law of averages means that they're going to be right more often than they're wrong about that. Now, stores also adjust their margins for highly perishable stuff, for special orders. So that 42% margin isn't the universal margin. They have the flexibility to change that. I worked with a grocery store in Rochester that was buying our herbs. They were running those herbs on like a 60% margin. They were buying stuff from us, and they were actually selling it for more than twice what they had paid for it. That's because they wanted to have a full selection of herbs on their shelf at all times, and they were pricing it so that they could afford to throw a lot of those herbs away. Stores need a margin, right? Stores have to mark up their products when they're going to sell stuff at retail so that they can do things like covering their losses. So that 35% that they have left, that has to cover things like the paying the produce manager's salary. It's got to pay for the floor space. It's got to pay for the heat to keep the store warm. It's got to pay for the electricity to keep the produce cool. It's got to pay for the warehouse space. All of that stuff fits in here. That's why stores need a margin. Now, you need a margin too for exactly the same reasons. If you're selling at farmers market, you should be charging considerably more, not just a little bit more, but considerably more for your product than you do if you're selling than you would if you're selling it to a retail store. And it's because you're having to cover all those same things. You go to farmers market, a customer picks up a tomato and drops it on the ground, and now you're not able to sell it. You've got to cover your loss for that. You've got to cover the loss of stuff sitting out in the sun and wilting and becoming unsaleable. You also have to cover the fact that there might be some products that you take when you don't get your pricing right, or when there's just a flush in the market and you've got product that simply goes home and goes on the compost heap. You've got to cover your labor, which for farmers market is not an inconsiderable amount of labor. You got to cover your stall fees, cost of the awning, cost of the tables, cost of the fuel to get to the farmers market. All that stuff has to be calculated in. Okay. Again, you can calculate a margin using this formula, taking the sales price minus the cost. So again, the sales price being what the store is selling it for minus the cost. That's what you sold it to the store for, divided by the sales price. Take that and multiply it by 100%. That's going to get your margins that they're charging. Spreading the costs over a larger volume translates to lower margins, right? This is pretty universal. It's why Walmart can sell products for half. There are some organic burritos that our local Walmart sells for half the price that our food co-op can sell them for, and it's because they're playing a volume game. And so everything translates to that larger volume translates to lower margins, and they're still making plenty of money. If you're running a small boutique farming operation, you can't be using Walmart margins. You need to be having much higher margins on your products. So I see that Beth has typed in that folks should feel free to ask questions at any time. Are we doing okay here so far? Not hearing anything. I'm
sorry about that, Chris. So yeah,
okay.
I think we're doing fine. I haven't had anybody type anything in just yet. So
okay, I know that. So it is kind of a funny thing, right? I'm trying to explain math, but I'm sitting here and I can't look and see if there are dazed expressions on anybody's faces. It is a little bit of a different thing than doing it in front of an audience. So I hope everybody's hanging on. So I want to talk about establishing costs of production now, because of course, I mean, you could do all this stuff theoretically, right? But it really comes down to what are your actual costs for producing something. I mean, if you say $20,000 an acre is what you need to make on a product, but that product is extremely expensive and time-consuming to harvest, then you might not be making a profit on that product, I mean, same thing's true if we say, well, I have to do 4 times my harvest, wash, and pack costs, or what I'm going to charge for at a farmer's market. Now, we used to grow a lot of shallots on our farm. We do it growing from seed, and we'd spend $2,000 or $3,000 a year on shallot seeds. They were very expensive. That didn't make sense then to use that same kind of a formula for actually for establishing a price. 4 times our harvest, wash, and pack cost. It just wasn't that high for shallots, but we weren't getting back what we needed to get for the risk that we were taking and for the amount of expense that we had put into the seeds and the extreme length of time that those plants were in the greenhouse for us as well. So we're going to talk about going through and figuring that stuff out. So, okay, so I want to talk about the fact that there are this concept called a production chain and a marketing chain, and these are the set of repeatable activities that happen for everything that you're producing and for every way that you're selling a product. Okay, and again, the key here is the repeatable piece of this. Okay, so for on the production side of things, you've got this chain that you follow that goes everything's seeds or propagation material. I mean, I realize that a potato isn't technically a seed, but it falls into that same category. If you're buying seed potatoes, that's a seed. Seed garlic is a seed. We may or may not do transplant production on it. Once we do the transplant production on it, and all transplants have relatively similar costs associated with them. They have similar ways and similar variabilities in their costs. We go from transplant production to doing the agronomy work. Now, I split this one here because the cost of doing what I think of as field work, which is agronomy, in the field is quite different than what it is in the tunnel. So we track those things separately. And then there's the cost of the harvest, and then there's the cost of the wash and pack. Okay, and each of these costs are going to vary by crop. Okay, not all of them are going to vary by crop, but most of them are going to have some variability by crop, and we're going to talk about how to track that here in a moment. For marketing and sales and distribution, which I call the marketing chain, okay, that's going to vary by the channel that you're marketing through. So if you're selling through a CSA, that has a very different cost structure than selling through a wholesale distributor. It's why you can afford to sell to a wholesale distributor at a lower price than you can afford to sell to a CSA for. Part of what we want to establish then is what are your actual costs for marketing to a CSA versus what are your actual costs for marketing to a distributor, and how can you make appropriate decisions about what kinds of margins you're going to be charging in those different avenues. At each step in the chain of these chains, we're going to be asking what's the basic unit, and we're going to be trying to establish a cost of production or a cost of marketing for each of those units. And so this is all going to come down to needing to collect some data. And this is my personal data collection system. I'm a big fan of the pen and the notebook myself. But I want to carry this with me so I can keep track of things all the time on my farm. This becomes a really key point here. You've got to have dollars. Dollars are numbers, and that means we're going to have to collect data and figure out how things translate into actual costs. Okay. Each step in the production chain has universal expenses, right? On my farm, we seed everything into 72s or 128s. That means that every transplant that we produce is going to have a certain cost for soil mix and a certain cost for flats. Okay, doesn't matter whether it's a tomato or whether it's a lettuce. There's a cost for soil mix and a cost for the flats that it goes in. There are also on our farm or for each crop, there has the potential to be crop-specific expenses at each step. Now, that's where things are variable by crop. Now, this is really important in harvest, wash, and pack. So you'll see this abbreviation periodically that I use. I shouldn't do that because you normally hate jargon, but it's HWP. That's harvest, wash, and pack. So in that process, it's very different to harvest lettuce than it is to harvest bell peppers, and it's really different to harvest bell peppers than it is to harvest watermelons. So we're gonna figure out ways to establish our costs in that step of the chain for each crop. You need to keep track of how much of each crop you planted. Okay, so knowing did I plant 10 acres of sweet corn or did I plant 1 acre of sweet corn? And the more precise you can get, the better off you're going to be with this. You need to keep track of how much of each crop you sold in both units and dollars. I mean, this is basic sales information, so you should already be collecting a lot of this information. And as we go through this, I'm going to be throwing out a lot of information that we're going to be asking you to collect in order to be able to do these calculations at the end of the year. And I always like to ask, how do you eat an elephant? And you do it one bite at a time, right? So it's just a matter of kind of chipping away at this stuff, and knowing that it's not like you don't want to be in a situation where you're sitting down in December trying to figure out what the cost of production was on carrots and going back and trying to figure out how you're going to piece together all of the information. You want to be thinking a little bit about this ahead of time and how you're actually going to capture this information in ways that are going to be useful to you when you sit down to do the analysis at the end of the year. So we want to capture data throughout the year. We want to do analysis at the end of the year. I'm going to talk first about production expenses. Okay, so again, this is all in that production chain. We said the first thing was seeds, right? Seeds can be highly variable. I mentioned that we used to spend $2,000 or $3,000 on shallot seeds a year. That was actually half of our seed budget. Even though we only grew an acre of shallots out of our 20 acres of production, that was fully half of our seed budget. Sometimes they're really cheap. So we keep track of our seed costs by crop. Okay, so how much did we spend on shallot seeds? How much did we spend on tomato seeds? This is good work to do, again, at the end of the year. If you kept all of your seed receipts, maybe you've filed seed receipts into a special file so that you know that you can find those. Maybe you photocopied all of them so that they're easily accessible to you. You can just go through and add that stuff up at the end of the season. Transplant costs, then. The first important thing here is how many transplants did you grow of each crop? Okay, I mean, that's pretty basic, right? Did you produce 1 flat of parsley or did you produce 2 flats of parsley? When we're figuring out a basic, what are the universal costs in transplant production, it is going to be things like potting soil, heating the greenhouse, labor. Now, I know people have tried to figure out what their costs are by kind of calculating, well, how many flats did I have in the greenhouse at a certain time and how much fuel did I use in the greenhouse. I don't know how your systems work where on your individual farms. Here we fill up our propane tank usually 2 or 3 times a spring. It's really not possible to say, oh yeah, I had this cost for a week in February and this cost for a week of transplant growth in March, and how many did I have at each time. We take all of our expenses for the greenhouse and we call those all expenses of producing transplants. We also don't differentiate between whether it was a 128 cell or a 72 cell. That just seemed like a little bit too fine for us to get down to. We keep track of our labor in the greenhouse as well. How many hours were spent actually doing transplant production and setting out the transplants. Now, the other thing that we keep track of then is where there's big variability. Okay, these are what we call our crop-specific expenses. If I have a crop like tomatoes where I sow it in a straight flat, and then I'm going to take that straight flat and I'm going to prick those tomatoes out and I'm going to put them into 72 cells, I want to keep track of how long does it take to spot up plants and which crops am I doing that with. If I've got crops where I'm using pea pots or I think Johnny's calls them cow pots, I want to keep track of that. Those are a lot more expensive than putting out a regular cell. If I'm grafting tomatoes, I'd like to know how long does it take to do that process. What are my extra costs associated with that? So you want to have your basic production expenses or your universal production expenses, and then you also want to have your crop-specific expenses. again, how specific are you going to get with crop-specific expenses? I know that I can seed brassicas quite a bit faster than I can seed onions, but really in the end, the variability on that really just isn't that great. So the one that I am going to keep track of, though, is spotting up, because even though I seed everything in the greenhouse, only some things get spotted up. So we're going to use this information to get what we call a base cost per transplant. Okay, so that's your total transplant expense minus the crop-specific transplant expense divided by the total number of transplants produced. So that's going to get us our base cost per transplant. Okay, how much does it cost to actually produce a broccoli plant in the greenhouse? Now, for any specific crop, then we would take to figure out how much money did we spend producing transplants for tomatoes. We'd take the base cost per transplant times the number of tomato transplants. Okay, so if it costs us 12 cents per transplant and we grew 100 tomato plants, that means that we spent, $12 growing tomato transplants as a base cost. But tomatoes have this extra expense because there's a specific cost that's associated with that spotting up process, taking it from the seedling tray and putting the plant itself into the 72s or the 128. So we need to add that in, and that's going to give us our total cost, our total transplant cost for tomatoes. Okay. Oh, you got to be kidding me. Sorry, hang on a second. I hit the wrong button. That was embarrassing. Here. There we go. Okay. So we're going to do the same. We're going to follow the same sort of a process out in the field. I want to talk about some specifics about how that works in the field. So agronomy is the cost to work the fields. It's anything that you're doing out in the field. That's all going to go into the cost of agronomy. Okay. Now, and we're going to work to establish a base cost of agronomy or base cost of field work per acre. That's things like building fertility, growing cover crops is part of the cost of production on a per acre basis. Even if I've got cover crops that I'm growing, if I put half of my farm in cover crops and half my farm in cash crops, I'm going to take the cost of the cover crops and I'm going to allocate that to the cash crops that I'm growing, because presumably I'm going to take those cash crops at some point in the future. I'm going to put them on that ground where the cover crops were. So I don't keep track specifically of a cover crop as far as it relates to a specific crop that's either preceding or following. Fertility building costs are universal. An agronomy is going to be everything up to the point that somebody puts a hand on a vegetable to pick it. Okay, so all of the costs that are from basically tilling, fertilizing, seeding, doing the actual act of seeding, okay, weeding, and potentially spraying all go into this base cost. These are all agronomy costs, and we're going to allocate these costs by acre. Because field and tunnel production have different cost structures, we do keep track of those separately. There are some crop-specific expenses. So everything that we've talked about up to now has been universal. Okay, some crop-specific expenses are things like hand weeding, mulching, trellising. If you've got pest control that you're doing, that would be a crop-specific expense. So if you're spraying BT on your broccoli, your cabbage, and your cauliflower, that would be a crop-specific expense. For hand weeding, what I recommend that people do is to actually track their normal hand weeding costs are allocated as a universal cost of agronomy. But if you have crops that take extra work to keep them going, or where the hand weeding is going to be particularly arduous, then you want to roll that back into a crop-specific crop cost. But in general, I know that on my farm, I'm pretty good at cultivating, but I don't get every weed that way, and I do send people through to do hand weeding. I don't track that kind of thing per cost, or per crop. But something that again takes more work. Carrots is usually one where we have to do more hand weeding. I want to make that into a crop-specific cost, and I'm going to keep track of that separately. Just like what we did with the transplants, we've got our total agronomy expense minus our crop-specific agronomy expense is going to be our acres of cash crop produced. That gets our base cost per acre. Okay, to get the total. And I have a typo down there at the bottom. Sorry about that. To get our total agronomy cost, base cost per acre times the number of acres of tomatoes, that's going to be the specific tomato agronomy cost. Okay, or plus the specific tomato agronomy cost. So, right, if I trellis tomatoes, that's going to be a specific tomato agronomy cost. Add the base cost plus the specific cost together, that's going to give me my total transplant cost for tomatoes. So this means that I'm going to need to make sure that I know what are my costs that are associated with trellising tomatoes. That's a special thing, right? Nothing else gets trellised quite like tomatoes. So what are the costs associated with doing that? You got stakes, you got string, and you got labor that's going into that. You want to make sure you're tracking your labor that goes into each of these areas. For harvest, wash, and pack, this is the most widely variable cost. Like we said earlier, it's a lot different to pick heirloom tomatoes than it is to cut broccoli. So I like to sample these each crop. I want to sample 3 times. How long did it take you? How many people were doing it? How many units did you harvest? Okay. That's the key information that we want to get. And then that can turn into a cost per unit for harvesting. And we do the same thing for packing. Okay, so we're going to sample 3 times for harvesting, 3 times for packing. Now, what we found over the years, and other farmers that I've worked with have found this, harvesting kale and harvesting Swiss chard aren't that different, right? You're stripping leaves off and you're throwing a twist tie around it. Okay, those are pretty similar. We've been able to establish some metrics and some foundations to say, this is what you're supposed to be harvesting per hour. If you're working on our farm, these are the kinds of things we expect you to be getting, and we've stopped sampling those things every year. This works the same way. Again, same idea here. Total harvest and wash pack expense minus the crop-specific harvest, wash, and pack expense divided by the units of cash crop produced is going to be your base cost per harvest, wash, and pack unit. So then you take that base cost, you multiply it by the number of units of tomatoes, add the specific tomato harvest, wash, and pack cost. So that's going to be, how long did it take you to pick and pack those tomatoes, and then divide that by the harvest and wash pack cost for the tomatoes. We keep track of our shop expenses separately. We have our bookkeeping set up so that it does this in a different area. We allocate that by acres. We take overhead and allocate that by dollars of sales. Okay, so that actually, we take all of our overhead and we're going to dump that into we're going to put that on by how many dollars of broccoli did we sell, how many dollars of tomatoes did we sell. That's going to be relative to how much overhead each of those is going to be required to take on. The base land, where you can think of this as an agronomy expense, but we look at it and say, well, how much does it cost us to be on our land every year? That cost is going to get allocated to acres. Okay. There are also then these marketing costs. So now we've really talked about production. We talk about marketing now. We talked about that marketing chain earlier. So things like that I like to think of as marketing and marketing is going to vary by what marketing channel you're selling through, right? Again, we said earlier there's a different cost associated with marketing through a CSA than there are associated with marketing through a farmer's market. If you market through a CSA, you don't have the expense of a farmer's market stall, okay? But you do have the expense of packing things into CSA boxes, and you do have the expense of things like producing a CSA newsletter, which most people don't do for a farmer's market stand. Websites. I know that most of the CSA farms that I work for, their websites are very much geared towards, and the work that goes in them is focused towards the CSA side of the operation. We're going to allocate our marketing costs by dollars. If I make $1,000 at farmers market every year and I make $2,000 with my CSA every year, I'm going to say, you know, and I'm going to take the specific costs and I'm going to associate those. But anything that's not specific, I'm going to allocate by, you know, I'm going to say, well, you know, 1/3 of that's going to go towards farmers market, 2/3 of that's going to go towards CSA. Okay, so for anything that I can't identify as being specific to one or the other. Do the same thing with sales, things like assembling CSA boxes, taking the orders, credit card processing. You know, this is a big one for a lot of CSA farmers now, are taking credit cards. So, you know, that's a cost that you don't bear at farmers market. It's a cost that you don't bear with your wholesale markets. So you do want to account for which market or which marketing channel is absorbing those credit card processing fees. The costs again of going to farmers market. There's also the cost of distribution, which is moving the products, okay? And this becomes tricky in terms of figuring out how you actually allocate those costs of distribution. You know, I know on our farm we would put wholesale and CSA when on the same truck. So you might say, how many pallets of CSA did I sell versus how many pallets or how many pallets of CSA went on the truck versus how many pallets of wholesale went on the truck. You know, how many times did we do that over the course of the year, and let's allocate it that way. Allocating by weight, I don't know anybody that does that because it's too complicated. Percentage of truck space would be kind of like doing it pallets. By the time that you spend on the deliveries. Now for me, I had my delivery route, I went up to the cities and came back to the Twin Cities the same way. It was a 2.5-hour drive to the edge of the cities. But once I was there, I could keep track of how much time I spent going to CSA sites versus how much time I spent going to wholesale sites, and that gave me some numbers that I could work with. Of course, the same thing would go to if you drive to farmers market one day and wholesale the next day. Of course, you could keep track of those separately by how many miles did you spend driving and how much time did each of those things take. Okay. There's not a clear, hard breakdown on this. Part of this is just thinking about, you know, what are the costs associated with getting to with delivering CSA products on a Thursday versus what are the costs associated with delivering products to a farmer's market on Saturday. We also have to take into account ownership costs. When you use stuff up, you wear it out. This is a picture of rototiller blades. These are blades that were 10 years old on my tiller. They do actually wear out. When I got new ones, I was shocked actually at how much we had lost off of there. Sorry, I'm going to grab a drink of water here. The way we get it at the cost that we're going to apply from the use of a piece of equipment or the ownership cost is we're going to take the purchase price, we're going to subtract the salvage value from the purchase price. So if I bought something for $3,000, say I bought my rototiller for $3,000, I know that when I'm done with my rototiller, I can sell it for $1,000. Okay, then that means so that's purchase price. Purchase price is $3,000. Salvage value is $1,000. I'm going to divide that by the life of the investment. So if I know that my tiller is going to last me for 10 years, and I've got $2,000 in it for those 10 years before I'm going to want to sell it for $1,000, so I take that $2,000, divide it by 10 years. That means I've got $200 a year. That's the annual change in the value of the asset. That's how much of it I'm using up. Now, I just sold off a bunch of equipment. Some of my equipment I actually managed to sell for more than I bought it for. But I still want to account for this because I've tied up capital in this. And so I think and the other funny thing that happens, of course, is one of those things that I sold for more than I bought it for was a tractor that actually increased in value while I had it. Tractors do that. A lot of times, if you're working with older equipment, you can buy something and sell it for exactly what you paid for it. So part of what you want to account for the fact that you've got money tied up in that. So I recommend with assets, just to use a 7-year life investment when you're talking about machinery and equipment, and a 20-year life of investment when you're talking about buildings. If you're still using the same building in the same configuration 20 years from now that you built today, you probably have a really static operation that isn't typical of most of the farms that I've seen. So I think figuring out establishing a salvage value that is lower than your purchase price, establishing a life of your investment, even if you're going to keep the darn thing forever, and assigning it an annual change in asset value that then you're going to put down as part of your cost of production. Farmers oftentimes fail to account for the fact that things do rust, rot, and depreciate. They do actually wear out, and they go away, and you've got to account for that in your overall expenses. So you want to take that annual change in your asset value, and you're going to assign that to the right area. So if I've got a rototiller and I've said I've got $200 of expenses associated with the rototiller, then I want to assign that to agronomy, right? If I've got a greenhouse that I built and it costs it costs $200 a year for the life of the plastic that I've got on it, and it costs $300 a year for what I paid for the bows that are going to last me for 20 years, then I got $500 that I need to put into my transplant production. Okay, that's as an overall universal expense. Okay? Don't underestimate that stuff. Valuing labor is a tricky one when you start talking to farmers. Especially in the organic industry, we've relied a lot on interns, people who are underpaid. Well, that does actually lower your actual cost of production. But I think you want to value your hired labor at their actual cost, but you want to get at what is your actual cost of hired labor. Okay? The actual cost of hired labor includes not just payroll, but in terms of wages, and it also includes payroll, that should have an X in there, payroll taxes. Okay? It includes the cost of casual labor. If you pay cash to a crew of migrant workers to come in and hoe your fields, then that's something you've got to pay for. It includes health insurance. It includes any perks. This is what I always call donuts. If you're feeding employees, that's a cost of having labor. The cost for payroll processing, if you're paying somebody to do your payroll for you, to file your payroll taxes. And the same thing, workers' compensation insurance is also a direct cost of labor. So you want to lump all of that stuff together into a labor category to figure out how much are you actually spending per hour. So that means you need to figure out, even if you're paying your employees on a salary or on a stipend, you want to figure out how much does your labor actually cost you per hour that they work. Because that's what you're going to know about your units, right? You're going to know how many heads of lettuce does somebody pick per hour. Okay, so now you need to have a cost per hour of that reflects what's actually happening out in your fields. I think that owner labor, the best way to value that is at the average labor cost on your farm. So take everybody else's average hourly rate and apply that to your owner labor. Anything else that you're making, those are actually profits. Okay, but if you're out bunching kale, you should be getting paid at the same rate as you would pay every other kale buncher on your farm. Okay. Then you're going to take that total, so you take that total labor expense, you divide it by the total number of labor hours, and that gets you your labor cost per hour. Okay, and that's what you're going to start applying. Well, how many hours did you put into your agronomy operations? How many hours did you put into transplant operations? How many hours does it take for you to spot up tomato plants? Okay, if you spend $12 an hour and it takes 2 hours to spot up a flat of tomato plants, then spotting up a flat of tomato plants costs $24. Or spotting up, yeah, there you go. Spotting up costs $24. You need to, then how many flats of tomatoes did you grow? That goes into your cost of producing tomatoes. Okay. So, of course, we say all these things about costs and costs and costs. The labor piece is, I think, the hardest thing for most people to keep track of, but it's also nice to have a good way to keep track of all of these other pieces. I like the classes feature in QuickBooks. Works really well for me. Classes in QuickBooks let you take your various allocations to a different account in QuickBooks, and then you can actually assign yet another category to them. So on my farm, we've categorized in the classes, we've categorized all of these expenses in the production and marketing chains. Okay? So we track our expenses. Okay? If I've got direct costs for selling wholesale that I can identify, off of a receipt, I'm going to give that a class of wholesale. Wholesale for us is divided into crops that we grow and crops that we pack, and then we've got farmers market, CSA, and then all the miscellaneous stuff. We also track expenses that are a seed expense. All gets put into a class called seed. Shop expenses, even though that might show up in a variety of different places in my QuickBooks accounting system, those all get classified as shop. Same thing with everything else here. Okay. Now we also track our income gets classified as well. Income classes are classified. So if I make a sale, when I write up that invoice, I mark that invoice as being sold to the CSA, to the farmers market. The reason I use the class is that sometimes at farmers market or through the CSA, I might be selling products that are packed like I would wholesale, but it's actually income that's coming in through the CSA, and I want to know that. Okay. So now we get down to the fun part. This is actually figuring out where and whether you made money. So what we're doing here then, for any given product and market channel, okay, your break-even price, what you have to sell the product for, is the cost of production and marketing divided by the quantity of the product that you harvested. Okay, that becomes your break-even price. So you take all of your costs that are for that crop, okay, and you divide that by the quantity of the product that you've got to sell. That's going to be the break-even price that you have if you sell everything that you've got. Okay? Same thing for a given product and market channel. The sales minus the cost of production minus the cost of the marketing divided by the dollars of sales, that's going to give you what we call our profit margin. Okay, so how much money are you making on a percentage basis? How relatively profitable are you when you sell through a CSA versus when you sell through a farmer's market? Now, when we ran some of these numbers on our farm, we found out that we were far more profitable selling wholesale than we were selling through farm market. It was actually a little bit shocking to me how different our profit margins were. And then we looked at the volume that we could move wholesale and compared that to the volume we could move through our farmers market in our area, and it became really clear to me that I was going to start going to soccer games on Saturdays. Okay. And then for a given product, then you would take the sales minus the cost of production divided by the sales. That gives you your gross margin, right? How much money am I making on carrots overall? And are carrots relatively profitable compared to tomatoes? Okay. I can also do the same. We said we could do this with markets. We can also do it with the sales. So I can look at and having these percentages is so much more important than saying, I made $10,000 on tomatoes and I made $1,000 on beans. Well, if you're making a 25% margin on beans and you're making a 10% margin on tomatoes, you should be putting a lot more effort into growing beans than you are into growing tomatoes. So this is what going through all of this is going to give you that kind of information. Okay. And that's what I've got there. So I'll do my little plug here. We do a weekly newsletter, right? It's a semi-weekly letter this spring. It's called the Flying Rutabaga. It's part of the consulting gig that we do, or that I do, and so you can sign up to get that at the website here, or you can also scan this thing if you're sitting there with your iPhone checking your Facebook page while you're watching the webinar. Take a moment and scan that little dots there, and then that'll take you right in, and you can sign up for it right away. There really should be some questions after I went through all that.
So yeah, actually we do have one right here.
Great.
In terms of selling wholesale, what's the rule of thumb that you use for determining whether or not a customer is eligible to get wholesale pricing or whether you charge them resale? Is it just a matter of outlet, or how do you determine?
Great. That's a really good question. For me, it's how does the product get to the customer? Okay. So, for example, if I'm selling at retail, I'm selling a bunch of beets, a bunch of beets, a bunch of beets. If I'm selling wholesale, I'm selling 24 bunches in a box of beets. Okay. To me, that's a wholesale sale. Okay. Now, I don't do a lot of work with restaurants. I know that restaurants maybe want, they want 2.5 pounds of this and 5 pounds of that. Well, to me, that's a retail sale. Okay, because the kind of work that I'm having to do, from everything from taking the order to dealing with the fact they probably aren't ordering a whole lot of products, so now I've got invoicing, okay, and the fact that they're doing split cases, which requires customized packing, that feels more like retail to me. Wholesale is when you take a whole case. If you don't take a whole case, then you're buying it at retail. It might be that in that situation, if you're having trouble determining whether a customer is wholesale or retail, that actually what you would want to think of is that you've got a case price, you've got a custom packing price, and you've got a retail price. Okay, so if somebody is going to take, they're going to call your farm and they're going to order 10 bunches of beets, 2 pounds of green beans, and 15 bunches of basil to be delivered on Friday, you don't have the same kinds of risks with that you have associated with going to farmer's market, right? You could take all that stuff to farmer's market. You might sell it or you might not. It might rain. It might be a hot and sunny day. It might be the day that there's a fair going on in town. Okay, so that's where I might say you actually have a couple of different price levels there for given products. And if you know how much time it takes to pack those custom orders compared to how much time it takes to actually put 24 beets in a box, okay, that begins to give you an idea of where and how you might set those prices.
Okay, so we do have another question here. So do you have different wholesale prices for different wholesale customers depending on the volume purchased, or is it just a set price?
So we have two different wholesale prices. You're either buying as a distributor and then you get a lower price, or you're buying as a store and then you get a higher price. I don't change it according to volume at different customers. The idea being that I don't want to get into parsing with people. I mean, see, if I'm selling something to the Wedge Food Co-op, so the Wedge buys for us, they buy twice as much as anybody else. Okay, they buy 4 or 5 times as much as some customers, but really the cost is more or less the same to get that to them. If I sell to a wholesale distributor, I'm probably selling a pallet load, or a lot of times when I make that call, I got one phone call, and I call Rick at Co-op Partners, and I say, Rick, I've got between 30 and 45 cases of broccoli, and Rick will say, sure, send me all you got. I'll pay you this price for it. And it's a done deal. It's fast. It's easy. It's dirty. I show up at his dock, and I unload between 30 and 45 cases of broccoli. Goes off the truck and into the warehouse. Really super easy. Okay. If I go to the Wedge, I've got an entirely different situation. I don't have a loading dock. I'm still having to wheel stuff into their back door. I'm not dealing with pallet loads of product. I'm dealing with mixed packs a lot of times in a different way than I am with the wholesale distributor. So I charge the Wedge, even though they're doing 10 times as much as my local food co-op. They both get the same price. The other reason that I do that is that the last thing that I need is, the world of produce, and especially if you're dealing with the natural foods world, it's really small, okay? And everybody's watching what everybody else is doing. And if you give one person a deal, then somebody else is going to feel slighted. And a lot of times, I mean, produce managers, they're kind of like chefs. These people are all, I don't want to knock anybody here, but they're all kind of like children. You've got to take care of them. You've got to stroke their egos. And boy, if they ever feel like they're getting dissed and somebody else is getting a better deal than they are, all kinds of bad things can happen as a result of that.
Okay, so we have another question regarding the price increase for organic versus conventional produce via wholesale or retail avenues. Have you seen, like, what have you seen in that kind of differentiation?
So the most of the wholesale accounts that I deal with require organic certification if you're going to be part of their local produce program. It's something that they just flat out expect. We build that into our pricing. I've always felt like we get a higher price for our product because it's certified organic. But because I've never really sold non-certified organic product, I don't have a point of comparison for that. And I haven't tracked how those prices might differ in our marketplace. That seems like kind of a lame answer, but I think it's all I've got.
Well, and I think, in terms of, calculating your prices, that's something that you'll probably be able to figure out. So for your organic certification, how would you allocate that? How would you distribute that across where would you put that in your classes?
Right. So for organic certification, we advertise our product and make a big deal out of the fact that we're certified organic no matter where I'm selling it. So if I'm selling to a CSA, if I'm selling to a distillery, or if I'm selling to a wholesale distributor or at farmers market, certified organic, USDA bug we make a big deal out of it. So that cost just gets distributed by dollars of sales across all of my markets. Okay, whether I'm selling, so again, if it costs me $1,000 a year to be certified, and I spend $10,000 at if I make $10,000 at farmers market, and I make $50,000 at selling CSA, and I make $40,000 selling wholesale, then I'm going to take a tenth of the cost of certification. I'm going to apply it to the farmers market. I'm going to take 50% and apply it to the CSA, and I'm going to take 40% and apply it to farmers market, just exactly the way the sales break out. Because the cost is really by dollars of sales for me.
Okay, another question. Have you done any selling to schools, and what would you suggest in terms of setting prices for selling through that avenue?
Right. So I haven't actually done any sales to schools. We went through a gaps audit and got ready to try to sell to our local college here, but it ended up being that the prices that they were offering were actually lower than what I was selling to wholesale distributors in the Twin Cities for, and I couldn't afford to sell it for those prices. Again, what I want to look at, the price I'm going to charge in a particular marketplace is determined by two things. What will the market bear, and what are the costs that I have associated with it? When I sat down and looked at the prices that my local college wanted to pay me for my product, I couldn't afford to sell it there. Okay? It just didn't make sense because my costs were too high relative to what I could sell the product for. Okay? So you want to take a careful look at that. But if I take product up to the Twin Cities marketplace and I go into a natural food store where Rock Spring Farm has a really good reputation and where organic product is really valued and they have loyal customers who are looking for local certified organic Rock Spring Farm product, I can charge a very different price in that marketplace. It's going to bear a different price than what my local school system is going to be able to bear. Okay? So you really have to balance between those two things, and I think, again, looking at what are the costs that are going to be associated with selling to the school. Is it a steady source of sales? How much work is there going to be in making the sale? Are you talking about 10 pounds of tomatoes, or are you talking about 200 pounds of tomatoes? And those are going to be the kinds of questions that you want to ask when you're setting your prices. What kinds of risks are you taking? Okay, I might offer a lower price to somebody who comes to me in the spring and says, Chris, in the fall, I'll take, 1,000 pounds of carrots every week for 10 weeks. I'm going to say, okay, great. I can settle for a lower price for that than I can for somebody who says, well, I'd like you to grow carrots, but I'm not going to promise to buy them from you. I'm going to buy them from whoever's got the cheapest carrots. Well, now I'm in a completely different ballgame. Did that help?
Yeah, I think so. But kind of related to that, you know, there is a lot of, you know, discussion in this, you know, farming world right now specifically about social justice and making sure that everybody in the community can afford to eat. How do you approach markets or outlets that cater to a clientele that maybe isn't as affluent as the families that are shopping at the, you know, the natural food stores and so on and so forth?
So, you know, John Mackey, the CEO of Whole Foods, how much money do you think he makes a year? I mean, what? I'll bet he makes $1 million, okay? I don't. Why is it my job to sell into those marketplaces? Okay? I mean, we've really kind of got, I mean, I feel like, so this is a political rant, not an economic rant, but I really feel like the wrong people are being asked to bear the burden of getting food to the underprivileged in our communities. Okay? Most farmers that I know are not rolling in dough. Okay? The people that make money in selling food are the retail stores and the wholesale distributors. It is not the farmer. Never has been, never will be. Okay? We want to do as well as we can, but we're never going to do as well as those people do. Okay? And so the why we get stuck having to bear that burden, I don't understand. My approach to servicing underserviced communities is to, I mean, again, if you're going to do that, you're going to have to go with what the market will bear, okay? But you better know your cost of production, because if you are going to service those communities at below your cost of production and marketing and distribution, you're going to go out of business, and then you're not going to be there to sell food to anybody. I've seen this happen to rural produce marketing cooperatives again and again, where they're trying to service rural communities, places where people aren't used to paying high prices for produce, and they go out of business or never do manage to help their producers make the transition from being large backyard gardeners earning movie money to actually being farmers, to actually making a significant economic contribution to their own family's welfare. They don't help them make that transition because the prices that they're paying their farmers are too low, and the price that they're paying for the margins that they're taking at the co-op are too low, and as a result, nobody wins in that situation.
I think those are some good points. So another question we have is, what would you consider a healthy percentage of gross income to be spending on your labor force?
Well, again, I mean, typical range for market farms is going to be between 37 and 52% from what I've seen, okay, as a percentage of gross income. And I'll tell you what, that varies widely, you know, especially when you're dealing with smaller operations. If you know, are you including the owner's salary in that? You know, the owner's monthly living expenses, are those part of it? You know, that's going to influence that. But I think those are going to be good numbers that you're going to see throughout the industry.
Another question is, do you set a specific percentage of the profit to invest back into the farm business, or do you just go off of what the farm needs from year to year?
I go off with what the farm needs from year to year. You know, I mean, okay, this is what depreciation is for, right? When we went through those examples, or that cost of ownership example, up here, you know, that you should be taking that money right? The annual change in your asset values, and setting that aside or reinvesting it in your operation. Theoretically, the real world, things aren't as theoretical as they are. Do you have that cash? Can you afford that money? Some years are better than others. Are you going to borrow the money instead of paying it up front? Those are all decisions that you have to make on an individual level. Paul and Sandy Arnold out in upstate New York, they run a small 5 or 7 acre operation, and they make about $200,000 a year. They talk about wanting to be reinvesting $10,000 to $20,000 a year in their operation. That's a number that I heard from them 10 years ago. I don't know where they're at now on that. So they're looking at reinvesting 10 to 15% of their gross sales every year.
So what would you suggest for someone who is just starting out on a farm of their own? How would you suggest they start setting prices for the markets that they're going to be going to on their own for the first time?
Well, I'd go back to some rules of thumb that we talked about right at the beginning of the talk, and really looking at our. I'm trying to get back there. I think the to do are to look at look at this one, 4 times the cost of harvest, wash, and pack, right? Even if you don't have workers on the farm, how much does farm labor go for in your area? Is it $10 an hour? Is it $10 an hour? Take that number, add another 30% for all of the other costs of having labor, like payroll processing and things like that. So if you would pay an employee $10 an hour, say that it costs $13 an hour for that employee. Figure out how much it costs you for the labor to harvest, wash, and pack your product, and multiply it by 4. And that's what you should be selling, be your retail price at farmer's market. Okay. Then I would work backwards from there. I'd use what we talked about with the margins, and I'd say, okay, so if that's my retail price, then I would take a 42% margin from that, and that's going to be my wholesale price. Okay. So, right. I think what I said just makes sense. The other thing that I would want to be looking at is this idea of $20,000 an acre. Okay. If I sell this product at this price, am I going to make on a per acre basis $20,000 gross sales on that acre? Okay. As a minimum price. Then I would do these other things like checking farmers market prices. Don't let other people oversell you. If you go to market and somebody's selling carrots for $2 a pound, and you think you're going to sell yours for $1, I double your price right there. Sell them for $2 a pound. And if you're not able to get $2 a pound for them, figure out why you're not able to get $2 a pound for them when somebody else is, and make those corrections. Whoops, did I lose you? Hello?
Sorry about that. I muted myself.
Oh.
Technology. So how specialized should an operation become if it finds that some products are just not worth growing? Is it really worth growing only a few crops in place of growing a wide variety, or when do you start coming to that conclusion?
I think it really depends on what your marketplace is. Obviously, if you're selling through a CSA, you need to have a wide diversity of crops. If you're selling, if you're selling at wholesale, diversity is important, but it's less important. When a store calls, the more things you can sell them, the the happier they're going to be. The less phone calls they have to make to source their product, the better you're going to do them. But it's a balancing act. I mean, you can't afford to grow things that you're selling at a loss. Okay, this idea of loss leaders that you see. I mean, some books talk about this, marketing ideas. This is what Walmart does with milk. Okay, again, you're not Walmart. You can't afford to sell anything at less than the cost of production. What I'd suggest doing is, if it's not worth growing, can you get a higher price for it? And if not, drop it. Try something else. But it is a balancing act. I mean, you can't be Dwight Schrute, right? You can't just be the beet farmer out there. If all you got's beets, nobody's going to call you to buy your beets. They're going to buy their beets from the guy that's got carrots and rutabagas too. So it's a fine line to walk. It's the other thing to look at. If something's not worth growing, can you produce it less expensively? Can you increase your yields? What can you do to change your own practices on your farm to actually increase your margin on that crop? I see a lot of organic vegetable farmers who consider it okay to lose crops every year, and I've noticed. I spend a lot of time visiting farms in the summertime, and I've noticed that there are really two kinds of farmers out there. There are the ones that by the middle of August look haggard. They look like they're walking death. It's clear they aren't getting enough sleep. They're physically exhausted and they're mentally exhausted, and they look like if you hit them the wrong way, they're just going to fall over. Then there's the farmers that are tired in August, who've been working hard. They're looking forward to when the heat's going to break, things are going to cool down, and they get on that downward slide. But they don't look haggard. They don't have that hollow stare in their eyes. The difference between the two is that the ones that are just tired in August or September, those are the ones who harvest every crop every year. Crops are the exception rather than the rule. The farmers that look haggard in August are the ones who are fighting primarily the weeds, but also the bugs, who don't have the control mechanisms in place for those. And so if you're looking at a crop going, you know what, this crop's not worth growing, I'd be one of the things I want to ask, are you losing crops? Is that part of why your production isn't what it should be? Should you be irrigating more? Irrigation is the cheapest. Water is the cheapest fertilizer out there. 2-3 inches of water a week is not a bad idea on most vegetables if your soil can sustain that. Okay, getting your fertility right, getting your pest control regimes right, reducing the amount of number twos that you have out in the field. Okay. And then really working on that harvest crew efficiency. And I think there's a lot of crops that don't seem like they're worth it. That if you get the horticulture right on it, suddenly do become worth it, because the yields go up and your cost of production, particularly for the harvest portion, go down, because it takes just as long to walk through a field of crappy broccoli, picking 1 out of every 10 heads, as it does to walk through a great field of broccoli, picking every head. Not quite, but pretty close.
So I think that was our last question at this point. And I think you just shared a lot of really great information this evening, Chris. I just want to remind everybody that there is going to be an audio-visual recording of this webinar available on our website at cvcountryside.org. And I'll likely make it available to Chris as well, and OEFFA will certainly have it on their website too. So feel free to check back on that, so you'll be able to look at Chris's formulas again and make some calculations of your own. So again, thanks everybody for joining us this evening. Chris, thank you for sharing your experience and knowledge with us tonight. And I hope you all can join us again in May.
All right. Thank you so much, Beth. I really appreciate your hosting me tonight, and I do hope that this was informative and useful for everybody. Thanks to everybody for coming.
Thanks, Chris. Good night.
Good night.